right, everybody. I hope you are enjoying that ridiculous new theme song. You are listening to the Nostalgia Trap podcast. My name is David Parsons. I thank you so much for tuning into the show, and I hope you enjoy these conversations. Lately, of course, these conversations have been a lot to do with the insane presidential primary season, and today's conversation is no exception. My guest today is Sarah Leonard. Sarah, many of you know as a senior editor at The Nation and a writer whose work appears in a variety of different publications. I'm sure you've seen her stuff, and if you haven't, a good way to introduce yourself to her work would be to pick up her book that recently came out called The Future We Want, Radical Ideas for the New Century. It's a collection of essays by young radicals, including Sarah herself, who write about the issues facing young people, especially, and how a new politics can be shaped that answers to a lot more of the population than our political system is currently designed to answer to. So I had a great time talking to her. She kind of, for me, I think, puts in perspective the idea that young people, especially, and I'm talking about like that millennial generation, people I guess in their 20s. Their experience of America and their experience of being young in America and being young out of college trying to get a job has been a big driving force in kind of shaping their politics, and that the future we want to kind of get back to the book's central argument. The future we want is going to be in part shaped by that generation and that generation's particular experiences. So that goes along with a lot of the themes of this show, which are about kind of like investigating the way that people's personal lives, and particularly their economic and political lives, intersect with kind of larger political ideologies and larger political trends. That stuff matters, and I'm interested in that stuff, and Sarah has a great way of kind of framing that for us. So I had a great talk with her. I hope you enjoy listening to our conversation. You can find more episodes of The Nostalgia Trap at nostalgiatrap.com. Also, I started up some new Facebook and Twitter pages for The Nostalgia Trap. I need followers. Please find me on there. And we can start a larger conversation on social media, and I have episodes posted on there and all sorts of other stuff. So again, I hope you enjoyed this episode. This is me talking with Nation editor and writer Sarah Leonard.
Most of us came of political age during the recession of 2008 and the crash, and that was transparently Wall Street's fault, and everybody on both sides of the political aisle knows that. And so, whether or not you got involved in Occupy, that was definitely a politicizing moment. And then you look and you see that Hillary Clinton is taking all their money, and you're like, well, this person definitely doesn't seem like she's on my side. And I don't think that's a giant leap or particularly sophisticated even. It's just sort of the signature issue of our generation under the circumstances. And then, things like the fact that, and I'll say up front, like, I don't think Bernie Sanders is the answer to all our problems. But when they debate...
How could you possibly say that? I'm going to leave.
I know. I'm going out on a long, long limb there. But... But, the fact that she can't just say, yes, college should be free if you want to go to college, everyone's just like, don't give me that long answer, man. Like,
yeah. And I mean, and it's interesting because it's not like young people went to the Republicans. I mean, and this is what I was talking about earlier is, because I came of age, I guess, during the 90s and really kind of came of age with 9/11 and George W. Bush. It's like this kind of like the Republicans are awful was what was in the air when I was 22 years old. Like David Cross had CDs out that were like, blistering attacks on how awful the Republicans are. And that became the kind of politics for a lot of people.
I do remember reading an Al Franken book.
Yes. Yeah. A couple Al Franken books.
There were many. I only read one. But
there's one, Lies and the Lying Liars Who Tell Them.
Indeed.
Yeah. And I remember reading that, Nostalgia Trap alert, reading that in the parking lot of Borders in the suburbs and just being like, this, finally someone's fucking telling the truth, man.
I was literally just remembering reading it in a Dairy Queen parking lot.
Yeah, okay. So these are the locations you read them in. In the parking lot, you figure out the first step of political awareness, which is the Republicans are assholes, and Fox News is like driving this Republican agenda. But now it seems like that's not the story right now. Like, as much as the Republicans are still assholes, as much as the Fox News is still nightmarish, and as much as we still have this kind of like monstrous right wing, they're more for young people. It seems like a lot of focus of their anger is at the Democratic Party and at the kind of like feeling that, well, these guys don't represent us either, and that's a big change.
Yeah, I think that's really right. I mean, there were always, I mean, certainly in the 90s as well, there were young people who were to the left of the Democratic Party and felt that way. I mean, the anti-globalization movement was certainly against the Democrats as well.
But that was like fringe stuff. Those are like the radicals. I feel like more of like
it wasn't like
mainstream-
80% of young primary voters.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. I mean, I have those memories as well of being like, did you know that Fox News, says like blah, blah, blah. Like,
it was so
and then
smug
like
in retrospect.
reading like, don't think of an elephant and being like, yes, this is the answer.
Oh my God. Don't think of an elephant?
Do you remember this? Is this
like an experiment in consciousness, kind of? Like
this was
the
a book
non-elephant?
that just argued that Democrats were framing things wrong. So if you tell someone, don't think of an elephant, whatever you do, don't think of an elephant, it's impossible, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the sorts of language that Republicans would use, right, they would never say, I don't know, what's a good example? They would always use sort of frames that would evoke their position, no matter what they were actually arguing. So they might say, what's a good one? Like, they had a bunch of these around abortion. It was like, instead of saying...
I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, what was their crazy phrase for late-term abortion?
Oh, God. I'm going to have to
But they would just, like,
rebrand
rebrand all these basic things.
They became good at propaganda in a way that the Democrats did not.
And so this was like a Democratic linguist making an argument about how Democrats could do this. And this was very trendy at the time because Republicans knew how to frame things in terms of their values. Democrats did not. Like, all of these debates about what the Democrats could possibly be doing wrong. And none of those debates touched on the fact that they had become as someone aptly put it, the second most enthusiastic party of capital.
Right.
So the actual material base of the party and the fact that that was causing the party to be this sort of like milquetoast, mediocre version of the Republican Party somehow never figured into these sort of like popular strategy sessions. And I think, certainly post-recession, it became very clear that, maybe it's not just that like Democrats' branding is not adequate. Maybe they're actually not on our side.
Yeah.
And so I do think that's been a really big shift, especially with the crash, where, not only do you see things still sort of mucking along in a sort of mediocre recovery under a Democratic president, but you see that this crash is a result of policies under Clinton. And, it doesn't take a genius to like trace this back to deregulation under Clinton. So, when you realize that, you have tons of student debt and the Democrats aren't helping you either, or jobs are down, which they are massively for young people. Like a quarter of young people are un or underemployed.
I think the situation for young people economically in the United States is far worse than most Americans understand. Besides, I guess young Americans themselves would be the ones that understand it the most. Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously, especially young people of color. There's a crazy stat that something like 82% of young black people who did not graduate high school but are looking for a job, which historically definitely would have been possible. There are all kinds of jobs you can do without a degree. 82% are unemployed.
I saw that stat at the beginning of your book, so I'm glad you reminded me about that. Because you have a book out that you edited with Bhaskar from Jacobin.
Indeed.
And the book, where is it? I have it in front of me. It's called The Future We Want, Radical Ideas for the New Century. And it's a collection that I think a lot of the listeners of the Nostalgia Trap would enjoy because it's written by young radicals, and it's like a collection of essays that throw out a bunch of ideas about what to do and how to approach these problems. How did this book come together? Whose idea was it, and how did you consider kind of what issues to include?
Well, Bhaskar and I started thinking about it because it felt to us like there was a lot of new energy on the left, particularly in our generation. You know, this was demonstrated with Occupy, but it went on, of course, people went on from there to join Fight for 15 or tenant organizing or whatever it was. There was the Black Lives Matter movement, which actually really came up after we had started working on the book. But we had time to include people from that movement in the book. And what we found was that particularly post-Occupy, there's a lot of dissatisfaction and a lot of new criticism and even quite radical criticism, which was encouraging. But no one seemed to have much of an idea of what we actually wanted. And it seemed to us like a fundamental of acting like you could actually win the fight you claim to be in is being able to articulate what you're after.
Mm-hmm. That theme comes up a lot on this show.
Yeah.
Figuring out what it is you want. And that's what I love about the title.
The profound question.
It's kind of, let's direct our intentions a little bit here.
Totally. And it's a tricky thing to do because on the other hand, you don't want to say, we, the intellectuals, have decided that the goals of the movement are X. Like, that would be incredibly pretentious.
Here is
and
our
also
10-point program.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Here, we're just going to pass it out. We solved all the problems. But that said, one thing that we felt we and the people in this book could contribute, and there are people in the book who are organizers as well, was to, do the research, do some thinking, like do the work. Like, what are intellectuals or journalists good for? It's like, well, there's a particular type of work they're really good at. So, like, let's put them on that,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so, for example, Megan Erickson, I think is just a wonderful thinker on education. And she's done a huge amount of research. She's written a book. She's a beautiful writer as well. And so that's someone who really has something to contribute on this front. And so she did an essay on how we should sort of envision education in the world that we want. Mm. And that's a crucial issue for obvious reasons, but also because it's a current political football. And so it's important to be able to say, we don't like charter schools, but we don't just not like charter schools. There's a thing that we want, and we're after it.
Right.
And so we tried to do this on a number of topics. We did environmentalism. We did criminal justice. We did I wrote one on gender.
What did you write on gender? Because I haven't read this yet. You just gave me the copy, so I'm going to read it.
So true.
But what's going on? What's going on with gender? I thought we had that solved.
Yeah, no, it's been going great. I personally have been really enjoying gender.
The golden age.
Oh my God.
The golden age of gender equality. I mean, we were talking earlier about
we're
how
actually post-gender.
Yeah, feminism. Yeah, we're post-gender. Feminism has changed a lot, and it's part of, I think, how weirdly Hillary Clinton feels like she's playing catch up with feminist issues. I mean, this came up with Corey Robin last week, was like the Gloria Steinem and Madeleine Albright thing, where you have like these two sour old feminists kind of saying really kind of nasty, unfeminist things. In a kind of there's a feeling of entitlement that comes from it, like just vote for her because, and it seems like that's a real turnoff for young, not only young women but young men too, who have a kind of attitude about feminism that's very different from that.
It's true. I mean, the way I would temper that, though, a little, and basically I agree with Corey on these things, who has written some smart stuff. But the reason I was hesitant to immediately berate Madeleine Albright and Gloria Steinem was not because I didn't think they were wrong. They're definitely wrong. Mm-hmm. And
Madeleine Albright, it should be said, is responsible for some really, really ugly shit throughout the world, including the murderous sanctions on Iraq throughout the 90s.
Yes, absolutely true. Yeah. I'm only speaking to these comments.
Whereas
Steinem,
she's I don't know for a fact, but I don't think she's responsible.
Probably
for
not guilty of murder.
Yeah.
Although that would be interesting.
We don't know. Investigative journalism.
Yeah, put someone on that. Was basically this. So I thought those comments were silly and, of course, also sort of funny. I mean, Gloria Steinem said, in case anyone was under a rock and missed this, that women or young women were joining the Sanders campaign because that was what was like cool with the boys. That's where the boys are, which was also hilarious because I was like, yes, definitely to meet men, I'm going to join the Bernie Sanders campaign. Like, who the hell had that idea? No one had that idea.
Oh, there's got to be a few that did that. Come on.
I'm sure there are some sexy Bernie supporters, but I'm not saying it's like the pool I would default dive into.
Well, it's a weird idea. It's a strange idea.
Now I feel bad. I'm like knocking Bernie supporters. I'm sure they're equally, if not more, attractive than other political supporters. The only point being that...
Have you seen the Trump crowds? I don't know about that.
That's, well, following the leader on that front.
Right.
No, and in fact, actually, it's the younger campaign.
Yeah.
But all of that said, I don't think anyone joins a political campaign because that's where the boys are. That would be like a strange strategy. Anyway... what I thought was sympathetic about what they were saying was that, every woman to some degree, maybe all men as well, come to feminism and generally come to politics in part through some lived experience that is painful, actually. And certainly being a woman in a patriarchal world, you get pushed around a lot. People don't take you seriously. It's a constant struggle just to be treated like an equal human. It's exhausting. And there's a part of you that cheers when women are in strong positions. And that doesn't mean I could conceivably forgive the doings of Madeleine Albright or Hillary Clinton, but the symbolism is not totally insignificant. And these are women whose experiences are in white-collar environments that are at the pinnacle of power. What succeeding in that environment looks like to them is what Hillary Clinton is trying to do. That's their work world, functionally, where there is rampant sexism. And so for them, there's something very felt about what they were saying. And it doesn't make it right. But there's a little part of me that's always hesitant to just come down really hard on women like that, because the forces of evil are well beyond
yes right.
So anyway,
I agree. I mean, that's
something I mostly want to direct towards my fellow sort of socialist men who I often see on the internet berating liberal women
or identity politics, not just women, but identity politics in general. I mean, this idea of yes, I think that it's very easily for socialist men to, especially socialist white men, to kind of say identity politics sucks and it's bullshit and it takes us off course of where we really need to be, which is a kind of larger economic critique. But identity politics exists for a reason, and people embrace those politics for a reason. And what you just said about the kind of lived experience of sexism is something that is real and is people act on that. And I think that you're right. It's complicated territory.
People think it's strategic to compound the pain,
right,
as part of convincing someone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the case with Madeleine Albright, because that is someone who is vastly removed from the influence of you or me. But if you're talking to someone who's roughly your equal on Twitter or something, if you are a man who is yelling at a woman, you're compounding some sort of experience of patriarchy, whatever you're saying, and you make it impossible for them to hear you. And so when I see that, I just think, first, don't be a dick. But second, how unstrategic.
Yeah, right. That's why whenever I'm yelling at a woman, I'm always yelling very positive, feminist and things very.
No, that's beautiful.
Very reinforcing. Yeah, it is really tricky territory, and it's happening with Hillary Clinton right now, winning southern states, and people. To switch to race. There is a tendency. I don't think it's a necessarily a tendency among all lefties or socialist people, but a tendency to be so disappointed that black people aren't voting the right way, right?
Yeah.
Southern black people aren't voting. They must be. There's almost they're stopping short of calling them stupid, but it's they must be voting the wrong way because they're voting for the person that's going to put them in prison, right? The Clintons are responsible. Hillary and Bill are responsible for some of the most noxious policies, toxic policies towards black Americans. So why would they vote that way? But there are reasons, and they have to do with lived experience in a lot of ways. Does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always hesitant to speak on this topic because I don't think that there's a totally clear, definitive answer for why the vote is going in this way. And my lived experience is not one of being black in America.
Right.
But from the...
But you saw The Help, right? So, I mean...
Ha ha ha. I actually never saw The Help.
No, I don't think you're missing much.
No, it seemed not. I read a lot of tweets about The Help. That was enough.
Yes. We'll get to Hollywood in a minute.
Yeah, right. Perfect.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, people who study this more closely than I, or have, or come from there, the South, that is, have expressed a number of things. And one of them is actually that a lot of black women in the South actually do identify with Hillary as a strong woman who has survived some really noxious bullshit. And, it is kind of her turn. And that's a sort of symbolic politics that I think is very legible to most people, whether or not you think it's right. And so you have to look at that and be in conversation with it. And why does that feel more connected to their experience than Bernie Sanders does? It's like, well, maybe Bernie Sanders is doing a pretty shit job of connecting with people around the things that they're actually feeling. Like, is that campaign instead telling people what they should be feeling, which is not a thing that works? Or maybe the campaign is doing all the right things, but they don't have the infrastructure for it. Yeah. I think it's, there are some really smart people working for the Sanders campaign. And, there are some larger structural questions, too. So, I mean, certainly, and this is a more complicated question, but the Clintons over time have built up a large patronage network. They were among the first to hire substantial numbers of black political consultants. And so their
that stuff
allies
matters.
It matters so much. And those allies go back a long time now. And those are the people who both do messaging and things like that, but also organize their communities and sort of direct political energy within their communities. And that's time that was invested a long time ago and still now. And that's what it takes. I mean, if you're not there, if you're not showing up, if people don't see your face, they're not going to vote for you.
I think that I like the word you use, legible, like creating a politics that's legible, meaning a politics that people can understand, that speaks to something that they know. And I think that's one of the tricks of politics in a lot of ways, is like creating that legible politics. So can we talk a little bit about education? Because I know you brought it up with Megan Erickson's article, because it seems like we're in an unsustainable situation, and particularly with higher education. But it seems maybe that's not true, because I know higher education, and so that's why I'm speaking to it. But it seems like we are in a situation that's untenable, and I mean economically. Like, we have students graduating from college with insane amounts of debt, and I think one of the things that I thought was really an interesting point in your book, in the introduction, is kind of like laying out this idea of like, not only are they graduating with unprecedented levels of debt, but they're also graduating into a job market that's not going to provide jobs that will allow them to even pay those debts off. But you mentioned a couple places where they can get jobs.
Wall Street's a great place for that.
Yeah.
Silicon Valley, also very good. You could work for McKinsey.
McKinsey.
Consulting.
Oh, nice.
They help reorganize businesses to cut jobs.
I need to learn more about that.
Yeah.
They help reorganize businesses. So, like, what you're saying, just to like underline that, is that the jobs that are available that pay decent wages are generally jobs with companies and institutions that are actively working to undermine the ability of people to make money in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, we just published an article here at The Nation by Astra Taylor about universities and hedge funds. So Harvard, Yale, they've long put money into hedge funds and billions of dollars. I mean, we're talking huge amounts of money. But now public universities are doing it too, in smaller places. The joke about Harvard is it's a hedge fund with a university attached, which, thinking in terms of numbers is true, actually. And Harvard is unique in many ways. Partly, it manages all of this or a lot of this internally. They have their own hedge fund managers, which is just incredible.
Yeah, makes sense.
It's sort of mind-blowing. But one of the things that she points out is universities are putting their money in these sort of terrible institutions which often lose their money. And what those hedge funds are doing is they, like any financial organizations, have a lobbying organization which lobbies for a number of things, but among them against relief of student debt.
Oh.
So the universities are basically paying hedge funds to lobby against their own students.
That is sickening.
It's pretty grim. Yeah.
God.
Yeah. And so some students
I thought Harvard had our back, man. I thought Harvard was
I know, it's a shock to us all.
Living, breathing emblem of American democracy. Geez.
Yeah, so sad. But so, the university itself, the university system is becoming increasingly privatized in all sorts of ways that screw over students, many of them extremely insidious. And where does the income income from investing in hedge funds come from? Well, like a lot of Harvard students go and work for hedge funds and then make big donations back to Harvard, which probably benefits Harvard financially more than being invested in these hedge funds, since that is in part where they lost a bunch of money during the recession. So, it's becoming a murky financial world up there.
Yeah. Becoming has been,
Well, it is emerging as.
Yeah. And it seems like more and more people kind of are aware of that. And it seems like this election is in part, like, even on the Trump side. I mean, if we can just talk about Trump and what's going on the right for a minute, I mean, it feels like the right is also experiencing its kind of own backlash from the rank and file, who are kind of like seeing through that the like institution of the party, and seeing that the party is not really helping them, and seeing that, I mean, me and Corey talked about this, about like the evangelicals being like really disappointed by George W. Bush. But did you anticipate that Donald Trump would get this many supporters?
No, no.
I mean, all of us
not.
were kind
I
of very
still don't
dismissive.
believe it. I didn't think Bernie Sanders would get this many supporters either.
True.
My mind has been blown by this election cycle.
Yeah, I think a lot of ours has, and that's part of the reason why I'm sitting here talking to you, is trying to figure out, like, what are other people saying about this?
You thought I was going to solve it.
Yeah, no, not solve it, just confuse me even more.
Oh, God. Well, that I can do. I mean, yeah, both Sanders and Trump have been a shock, of course. And there are a number of people who say that they would vote for either of them, which I think is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
And what it does seem to speak to is just that people are so tired of being lied to. People feel so screwed over. And, Trump lies, left, right, and sideways. But it's true that he is unconstrained by financial overlords of any kind. I mean, you could argue he's constrained by his own financial goals.
Right.
As exemplified by his like weird product placement press conference where he like had Trump steaks next to the podium. It was truly one of the weirdest looking things I've ever seen.
That was very recently, right? Just like yesterday or something? He had the meat like piled up?
Yeah, and like his brand of wine or whatever it was. It was super strange. I mean, this is the most surreal election I've ever seen.
I know. It makes me wish like Hunter S. Thompson were still alive. But I think
his head would explode. It's like too much.
Yeah. In fact, he wouldn't even need to write about it, because it's just like you're watching an acid trip. Yeah. I mean, a friend of mine like texted me the other day, like, "Are you watching the Hunger Games?" Because
and you were like, sort of.
It was the GOP debate, and I was like, I mean, the way that Megyn Kelly was made up, they're all made up. It's not just Megyn Kelly, but they're all made up like reptilians. It just feels like there's almost like a troll aspect to Trump, like he's trolling the system. It feels like
he just very trolly.
It feels like I don't know. On the one hand, I feel like, oh, it must be like voting for Trump must be like a fuck you vote, kind of like fuck the system. I'm just voting for Trump. But at the same time, like it doesn't seem like that would be sustainable for this many states and this many people voting again, unless it's just. I mean, the right in some ways is even more upset than the left in terms of like feeling like they've been ripped off by the people that are supposed to support them.
Yeah. I mean, it is worth keeping in mind that the people voting right now are primary voters.
Yeah.
And so I think
that's the place for the fuck you vote, in a way.
Yeah. And I mean, as Josh Holland pointed out in a piece he did here, there, something like, 6% of voters have ever cast a ballot for Donald Trump. And this was before the Super Saturday primaries, but his point was that actually the number of people who vote in primaries is relatively small. The margins are relatively small. He's getting like a third of these votes, he's getting a plurality. He's not getting a majority. So it is scary, and it's scary how sustainable it has proved to be. But it's actually less large than I think it feels.
Yeah.
Most people...
The media adds an element of spectacle and insanity to it. I mean, I think that if I got on my phone right now and looked at any major news site, Trump's picture and a story about him would be everywhere. And not as much Sanders. Like, there's a Sanders won...
Well, he's less outrageous,
Yeah. Sanders is outrageous, too, in his own way.
In like a grandpa way.
Yeah.
But, I mean, Trump was literally on WWF, and, if you watch his clips from professional wrestling, it's like the same thing he's doing now. He really learned how to do it from the showmanship required on that show. And it's amazing. If you have not watched his clips, you should definitely do it. Yeah. There's one where he punches, what's his name? The sort of CEO guy.
Vince McMahon.
Yeah, he punches Vince McMahon in the face. And I guess does not actually punch Vince McMahon in the face, but this is performatively, yeah, and it's like a pretty compelling knockoff of a punch. And I'm just like, oh my God, this is like the guy who's leading the Republican nomination. We've gone full bore into entertainment politics, and he's so good at it.
Yeah. That was I hate to mention another publication, but Matt Taibbi's article in Rolling Stone recently about Trump kind of like driving a truck right through the American political system. It talks a lot about that kind of stuff, about Trump's savviness as kind of, he's basically turning the election into what it's been for a long time. He's just kind of like almost like revealing to everybody else what this is, like how crass.
This is what I love about the dick jokes they've started making. So Marco Rubio talking about the size of Trump's hands, dick, and Trump then retaliating, and his obsession with calling him Little Marco, which is also just weird. And it's just like the veneer has been stripped away, and we have what these competitions have always been, which is like a pissing contest.
Yes.
In the most literal sense.
Between elite families.
Between
elite families that are really friends behind the scenes.
Right. All been to each other's weddings and so forth.
Right. And I think a lot of Americans know that. Like, more Americans than ever before are seeing through. I mean, I think the last time I talked to you, Sarah, which was probably like a year and a half or 2 years ago.
Yeah, crazy.
I know. Time flies. Time flies in a dystopia. But the last time I talked to you, we were talking about how devastating and depressing it was that we might have like Bush Clinton again. This was before Jeb opened his mouth and everyone realized what a tool he is. But it's like the idea was, God, how can they keep doing this? How can we keep putting up the same families again and again and not have Americans connecting the dots and seeing that they're being controlled by basically, a small group of people? This is the Occupy revelation in a lot of ways, right? Is that like there's a 1% and a 99%.
Yeah.
And it seems like this election is kind of a symptom of that, with Trump as the kind of the guy that's giving you the real thing through all the bullshit, but it's somehow all bullshit too. It's kind of boggling.
Yeah, it is really weird. It's an oddly American thing that someone can be a billionaire and be considered an outsider. Like, he's an outsider who hangs out with ex-presidents. He's an outsider who owns a lot of real estate. He's like an outsider who is friends with every mayor of New York. Like, what kind of outsider rather is this? It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
But he has, in a sense, through the campaign, become more of one, if I dare say that, in the sense that he is undoing the careful work of the Republican Party to do things like coat their racism in the sort of sugar of phrases like the soft bigotry of low expectations and so forth. They've done a lot of work to not look explicitly racist. And then he just goes out and is like, we shouldn't let any Muslims in. And the Republicans are like, shh, you know? So
he's I mean, if nothing else, and that's what's kind of interesting about this election is like, he's going after that Republican Party that Al Franken was writing about in the 90s, right? Is that he's going after that Republican Party that's the old evil Republican Party, but then there's like what replaces that is something possibly more terrifying.
Totally. It's really hard to tell. I mean, I'm hesitant to pronounce on Trump because I just have like no clue. Yeah. I mean, if he became president, God forbid, he could, on the one hand, turn out to be less bad than most Republicans, and he's like kind of fine with healthcare and whatever. Or he could really scapegoat minorities in ways that are terrifying and, start building internment camps, or both,
Right.
And it's just like, I don't know.
Well,
it's really
economic populism and
never
racism.
Never held office.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, and that's hard to judge him at all. I mean, part of me feels like he's going to win the nomination and then just like quit, as a joke.
Drop the mic.
Exactly. Drop the mic, rip his mask off, and he's Richard Nixon underneath or something. Yeah. But it feels like, in part, I don't know. When I hear liberals, whoever they might be, wherever I might find such creatures, I feel that are kind of expressing this terror over Trump. It kind of makes me feel like, where were you in the last 8 years? Particularly like when I hear things like Trump will be unkind to immigrants. I mean, the Obama administration has deported more immigrants than any president in recent memory, and his policies have been really gross in that respect. When I hear liberals saying, "I'm scared that Trump will take us to war," Obama's
don't worry,
foreign
we're
policies,
there.
Right? Obama's foreign policies are in many ways further along the line towards a total executive fascism as George W. Bush. So it's weird when the liberals come around to being terrified about the right, because we've seen the right winning for so long, and they're like kind of in the Democratic Party too.
Yeah, a lot comes down to what type of person you trust. Obama feels very reasonable. Trump feels very crazy. But this is where American politics is almost uniquely irrational, because we don't vote for parties fundamentally. This is not a parliamentary system. We're not voting for a slate of candidates based on the party. We're voting for politicians. And there's no criteria for being in one party or the other. You can't get kicked out of the party. We don't have a serious party system. Mm-hmm. So we end up hanging a lot on these sort of personality questions, which are sort of it's hard to tell with Trump, but often irrelevant. It's like basically Republicans are going to do what Republicans do and Democrats are going to do what Democrats do. Mm-hmm. It's more useful to look at where the money is coming from and so forth than to say, like, this person seems like they have a steady temperament. Like, you don't fucking know.
Yeah,
like, it's
right.
just pointless information.
Yeah.
So
it is really, really tricky when it comes down to, like, questions about how much it matters that the president is this way or that way personally. Because, I mean, when you study, like, I study the Vietnam War and I look at Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, those guys were nuts. And, like, a lot of their foreign policy decisions were made, as filtered through that kind of temperament idea. And people talk about that stuff a lot. I don't know how convinced I am that it matters.
I mean, I do think this is a thing that tends to frustrate me in the sort of Bernie-Hillary debates, is that people will say, well, she's very experienced and she's very serious and so forth. And that may be true. She actually has spent a lot less time in public office than Bernie Sanders has. So it depends what you mean by experienced. And I also, of course, would say that she's experienced doing things that I think are bad. So at that point, I don't care how qualified you are to do bad things. But what's more useful, I think, is to look and see, okay, Wall Street, oil companies have given a lot of money to one candidate in this primary and not to another candidate in this primary. And since we're all people probably who believe in campaign finance reform because we think money influences politicians, why wouldn't that be a more persuasive fact than temperament.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting because like House of Cards is really popular right now, and like my students, they kind of cite it when like describing their cynicism, and when describing like, and when not just their cynicism.
Well, it's a big difference. Like the West Wing was popular when I was younger, you know,
wow,
and that's like
that's incredible.
The most like painfully earnest, pompous sort of celebration of American democracy and the politicians who run it. And, you know, I loved it when I was like a 14-year-old Democrat, you know, like you're just like the people in there are just trying to do their best, making tough choices for the country.
Yeah.
And like, wouldn't it be amazing if we had a president who was not only liberal, but also religious and an economist? You just like solve all the problems. And like that was really, really popular. And now the thing that's really popular is this show that's about how like a small cabal with a private, you know, military unit is like running the country secretly and murdering people. And like everyone's kind of like, yeah, that feels right to me.
Yeah. And you know what?
I'm sorry. I just like mixed Scandal in there. But Scandal's also really popular and it's really similar.
Well, I mean, we need Rick Perlstein here because I'm reading Rick Perlstein's like amazing trilogy of like the 60s and 70s and leading into Reagan. He talks a lot about the Watergate, the post-Watergate Vietnam era, that like early to mid 70s being a similar time in the sense of like people are watching like movies are being made. Everything is about like how disgusting and like disgustingly corrupt everything is, and there's like no hope for anything. Like Chinatown is a good example, but there are just a million examples of like Americans felt in the 1970s like roughly like they do now, in the sense of the economy sucks and the place is run by corrupt, essentially murderers, rapists, psychotic losers running it. No, I guess they're not losers; they're winners. But they're either way corrupt, nasty monsters running our shit, and there's no point in even kind of trying to change things. It feels like young people don't feel that way in terms of like the last part I said. They're like, there is a feeling that there could be some change, but I don't know. Do you feel like Bernie is the revolution? Do you feel like that's just maybe a pragmatic choice that young people are making because he's up there?
I think it's pragmatic. I mean, if you want to look at it the way Beltway analysts like to look at these things, I mean, you could certainly argue that this is young people voting for their self-interest. I mean, what is in our interest? Free healthcare, free college,
right?
Higher minimum wage. These things are in our interest. So I do think it's pragmatic. I think the campaign will prove its value if, when it's over, whether or not Bernie Sanders wins, the money and the organization goes on to benefit a larger, more ongoing socialist movement. So you saw with Obama that he took, when he entered office, he took his contacts and his advocacy organization with him, and it became very supportive of the White House and so forth. So there was no large organization that came out of his campaign that was independent and could push politics to the left, which I would argue would have actually benefited him. But
it seems like that wasn't
depending
his
on what
desire.
you think he wants.
It doesn't seem like that's his politics even.
Well, it functionally wasn't in the end, so I guess it doesn't matter. But if Sanders it means what he says, and he does talk about this, that those resources will go to fuel something that is much bigger than him. And that's what we need. I mean, even if we elected him president, could he get all these things that we want through Congress? Like, no. I mean, I don't think Hillary could either. But it's going to be very, very limited. So whatever we do, like, we have to be looking past this election.
Yeah. I mean, and I don't know. Reading this election, you're like, it's kind of it's disturbing in the sense of it's hard to figure out what's going on. In part, though, I think it does feel like a transitional election, a movement towards like a new politics. I think the book you put out is kind of very prescient in kind of feeling out a lot of the issues that are going to be dominating the political conversations for years past this election. It's not just Hillary versus Bernie. Do you think that Bernie, part of the Bernie support is like an anti-Hillary vote, or do you think it's a pro-Bernie? How much of it?
Well,
hard
both,
to tell, right?
But I kind of think it's a pro-Bernie vote. Like, O'Malley didn't do all that great, you know?
Good point. Yeah.
And so Bernie's representing something that seems definitely outside of the system, which
Yeah.
is socialism. No one calls himself a socialist in America. Oh, now maybe.
Yeah.
Which is cool. And I think we're in an educational moment. Like, everyone's like, okay, I don't know, maybe I'm a socialist. Does anyone know what that means? Like, not really. So we're in a really good moment to talk about what that means and what it should mean, for that matter.
Yeah, not only talk about what it means, but collectively redefine it in some way.
Totally.
You know, for the Instagram age.
It'd be a very photogenic socialism.
Yes. I wanted to ask you about just working in journalism during politics. It seems like there's a pressure, and this might be just maybe something on social media, but to always have like a hot take on things, and it's kind of like immediate reaction. Like it's part of the reason I took a break from Facebook was feeling like the pressure to like come up with like a really like savvy, amazing, fresh, compelling angle on like whatever happened 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Do you feel that pressure, or is there a balance that you have to have that's kind of like between having a hot take and seeing the kind of larger patterns that are happening?
Right. Well, I have the advantage of being an editor, and I write as well, but I don't have to be producing a set amount of stuff. Mm-hmm. That means I can ignore a bunch of stuff, which is great. I do find that Twitter in particular sends me into like a death spiral of caring about minor incidents. And so when, Twitter is where the Bernie bro is discussed ad nauseum.
But virtually nowhere else.
Nowhere else. And in fact, when I wrote about this, but I was interviewing a member of the nurses union about their support of Bernie. And I was like, well, there's been this discussion of, Bernie bros. Like, what do you think about that? People have been talking about it a lot on Twitter. And she was like, I hadn't heard that. I don't really use Twitter. Like, she's like
right.
a nurse.
Yes.
She's not like sort of trying to like hustle the media beat.
Right.
No one else cares about that,
Mm-hmm.
And so it can be a real trap to have to be constantly responding to things, because what you end up responding to is the most accessible thing, which is usually like the thing on the internet. But like most humans are not promoting their points of views constantly on the internet. Right. That's the thing media people do, and then it becomes a horrible bubble from hell. And if you look at a lot of these sort of hot takes, you will usually find that the journalist did not actually interview anybody. This is just like a thing that they're throwing out there.
Right.
I do think there's some value in, if you have a sort of political worldview, it could be socialism, it could be a certain form of feminism, whatever. I do think sometimes there's value in latching on to a big thing that happened that everyone's talking about and using it to get that worldview out into the open.
Right.
Using it to make something marginal seem relevant to other people. And so that can have a place. And I actually, I've done that myself, and I respect that. The problem is when you have some sort of quota and you just have to respond to everything, then first you end up focusing on media, sort of surface things. And second, you end up blowing things that are not that important vastly out of proportion and like wasting a lot of energy. So
it's almost like the outrage machine.
Long-term work.
Yeah. I feel like there's especially among liberals and left people, there's like this need to like constantly be outraged. Maybe that if I were on the right, it'd be the same thing. But like this pressure to like be outraged about whatever was just said. And I mentioned the 90s and even past the 90s before like real social media. It was like, did you hear what Bill O'Reilly said? Did you hear what Bill O'Reilly said? Did you hear what Bill O'Reilly said? And it's kind of like puts you in this very reactive mode on the one hand, but also outraged all the time, and it feels like
exhausting.
Yeah, it's just not only exhausting, but like distorting in some way to kind of like how we understand what's happening. And I can imagine, again, I don't want to feel like putting ourselves on a pedestal here, but we think about politics a lot, and a lot of Americans don't really. They only kind of see this kind of like distorted fight on TV, and I just wonder like how anyone has any sense of what's going on at all. It seems like a very, very surreal and confusing moment because of the way the media works. And I hate that word, the media, because it's not one particular monolithic place. But
right.
It seems like I don't know. We're in a different moment.
Yeah.
MMA fighting. It's super popular. Do you think it's a sign of the further decline of American values into savagery and violence, or do you think MMA fighting, the popular MMA fighting, is perhaps a safe place for us to work out violence in a kind of like cathartic way?
I don't know if it's really more emotionally violent, at least, than like watching, like late era Real World. It's like it's certainly less complicated. We've had boxing forever. I don't
NFL football, boxing. Yeah, there is a kind of like tournament violence that I feel like is like
which may be what we're watching with the Republicans.
That's why I had that thought with the wrestling.
Like Freudian about the space that we're in. We're like, oh my God, we just want to watch people compare their dicks in a ring.
Yes, and not only that, but like,
I don't know if that's new though.
Not new at all, but more on the surface. Like watching MMA fighting being like projected on the TV at Applebee's. It's just something I haven't really experienced except for one time, which I was in an Applebee's and saw all the kids watching that, and it made me think of remembering growing up. That style of fighting, of like guys ripping each other to pieces, was like very taboo. It was like porno video having an MMA thing, and now it's like on major networks. Kids are watching it. It seems like a change. I brought that up in part just to kind of like tie in the Trump thing, because it feels like there is a like violent spectacle going on. In the Tybe article, is like people surrounding protesters at Trump and like screaming Trump, 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 USA, USA,
Yeah,
USA, and it just feels. I don't know. I can see it both ways in some sense of like there is something being released. There's energy being released in this election. Bernie Sanders. I do not feel like I'm going to go pull a lever for Bernie Sanders, and the reason is because I care a lot about foreign policy. That's like my bag more than domestic politics, just because I write about the Vietnam War and I'm kind of really interested in that stuff, and particularly America's relationship to Israel. What would it be that would make you not want to vote for Bernie Sanders if there were something? What is it that makes you think Bernie Sanders? What are you most troubled by Bernie Sanders? Put it that way.
Well, I would agree with you on foreign policy to some degree.
It's much more complicated than I painted it, but
yeah. I mean, he's not been very forthcoming on foreign policy, and it's not. I don't think he's radical on foreign policy at all. I think he's less of an adventurist, and I think he'll be more inclined towards a sort of quasi-isolationism than Hillary, and I actually think right now that's a good thing. And he's been straightforward about his support of normalizing relations with Iran in a way that I think is very good. And Hillary has responded with a series of basically Republican talking points. So I think he's better on that front. But I have also been troubled by the seeming thinness of his opinions and the fact that probably they don't differ much from the sort of mainstream Democratic Party. I have criticisms of him, but I'm not sure any of them rise to the level of things that might dissuade me.
Right.
Mostly given who he's running against. So, like, there are a bunch of things I think he does kind of badly. I mean, gun control, he's sort of moved on. Good to see that. I mean, he's a senator from Vermont. I honestly, like, I'm less troubled by that than some people. I think his sort of discomfort or his lack of eloquence around sex and race are major problems. I think they're problems for the larger left.
Yeah.
And so often when people say, what should we do after the campaign? It's like, well, you should go try to like repair those problems on the larger left. Like, if you're a man, go work to support work that women are doing. If you're a white person, go support work that black people are doing. Like, try to figure out like how we start solving these problems, because Bernie represents so many of them.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think that young people are looking to Bernie Sanders in part not because they love 75-year-old Bernie Sanders, that it's not a personality thing as much as we'd like to think that personality plays a big role, and it does. It seems like it's actually ideas that are drawing people to Bernie Sanders, and that goes to the book that you and Bosker put out, The Future We Want, Radical Ideas for the New Century, which basically kind of lays out a lot of those ideas that I think are gaining popularity. Bernie is kind of a representative of those ideas more than any other candidate, and so if you feel that way, the way that many young people are feeling, I think post-Occupy, I don't want to say post-Black Lives Matter because I feel like it's a movement that's still happening. But at the same time, it seems like Bernie, whatever you think of him personally, is the only person that's speaking of those kinds of issues.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So it's a way to sort of broaden the American political imagination.
Yeah. Very, very tricky election to figure out. Sarah Leonard, thank you so much for sitting with me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.